Black salt paste on toast in a kitchen in Erskyneville. The yellow lid you twisted off without thinking. The thin scrape across the butter your mother taught you was the right amount. The small red label that hasn't changed in 100 years. 22 million jars a year. 80% of Australian homes. Now picture that same jar on a soldier's mess tin in the Owen Stanley range, 1942. 25 grams of black salt paste, keeping a young Australian alive in a malarial jungle, 6,000 kilometres from Port Melbourne. The man who invented that paste was Cyril Callister. The man who funded it was Fred Walker. By the time that mess tin was filled, Walker had been dead for 7 years, and Kraft Foods of Chicago owned the company. By the time Cyril died of a heart attack at his Kew home on the 5th of October 1949, the jar he created was already American. 100 years. 3 corporate parents on 5 different flags. How did Australia's most patriotic spread cheat death after 82 years of foreign ownership? If you grew up with Vegemite on toast, hit subscribe. This story is worse than you think. Chapter 1. The Boy from Shute. Goot, Victoria. Population 18 at the last census. A hamlet so small you would miss it if you blinked driving the road from Beaufort to Avoca on a wet Sunday afternoon. 2 churches, 1 sheep paddock the size of a suburb, Western District wind that cuts through wool jumpers and finds the bone underneath. Cyril Percy. Callister was born here on the 16th of February 1893. His father William Hugh Callister was a state school teacher and the local postmaster, Scottish Australian heritage, Methodist discipline. One of 9 children in a weatherboard cottage where the rain on the iron roof kept the kids awake at night. Rosetta Ann Dixon, his mother, was the daughter of an English wood sawyer who had come to Victoria during the gold rush and stayed. Education came hard and far away. Grenville College, Ballarat, then the Ballarat School of Mines, the institution that would later become Federation University, then a scholarship to the University of Melbourne, Bachelor of Science, 1914, Master of Science, 1917. The first member of the Callister family to set foot inside a sandstone university. In January 1915, Cyril took a chemist's job at Lewis and Whitty, a Melbourne food and household products manufacturer at South Melbourne. 5 months later, he enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force. He was 22 years old. He wanted to fight Germans on the Western Front like every other young Methodist farm boy in Victoria. 53 days later, the Department of Defence pulled him out. The minister himself signed the order. The Empire had plenty of riflemen. It did not have enough chemists. Cyril was sent to His Majesty's factory at Gretna, in the Scottish borders, the largest cordite factory the British Empire had ever built. 12,000 workers, mostly women, mixing nitroglycerin and gun cotton in long sheds along the Solway Firth. Devil's porridge, the locals called the explosive paste, after a phrase coined by Arthur Conan Doyle. The work was deadly and the pay was good, and Cyril was 23. In Annan, the small Dumfriesshire town nearest the factory, he met Catherine Hope Mundell. They married at Annan Parish Church on the 8th of March 1919. 2 months after Versailles, with the world rearranging itself around them, Cyril packed his Scottish bride onto a steamer and sailed home. He rejoined Lewis and Whitty in Melbourne. 3 years went by. Then the company hit a takeover and Cyril needed a new job. The Yorkshire boy who had made British shells in Scotland was about to invent the spread that would define a nation. But first, he needed a job, and a businessman in Hawthorn needed a chemist. Chapter 2. The Hong Kong Merchant. Frederick Walker. Born the 5th of January 1884 in Hawthorn, Melbourne. Caulfield Grammar Scholarship boy. Sharp-eyed, impatient, restless before he could shave. He left school at 15 and walked into the Melbourne offices of J. Bartram and Sons, produce merchants, canned goods exporters. Fred Walker spent 4 years there learning everything Bartram could teach him. Canning, refrigeration, the brutal arithmetic of moving perishable goods across half a hemisphere without losing your shirt. He took notes in a hardback ledger every night. In January 1903, aged 19, he sailed alone to Hong Kong. While the Chinese were boycotting American goods, Fred Walker founded Fred Walker and Company in a rented Kowloon office and began selling Australian canned meat to British colonial officers, Indian sepoys, and anyone else with a tin opener and a shilling. He came home in 1907 with capital in the bank and a brand of his own. Red Feather, canned beef, canned cheese, canned butter, canned dripping. Sold across Asia, South Africa, the Pacific Islands. His Melbourne factory was at 76 to 82 Kerford Road, Albert Park, on the site of the old South Melbourne College. He bought it cheap when the school closed. Ran his canning lines through the converted classrooms. The factory smelled of brine and tin solder and wood smoke. In 1925, James L. Kraft of Chicago came to Melbourne. The American had patented a method for processing cheese that doubled its shelf life, and he wanted an Australian licensee. Walker volunteered. The Kraft Walker Cheese Company was incorporated as a 50-50 joint venture between Fred Walker and Company and J.L. Kraft and Brothers. Kraft brought the patent. Walker brought the factory and the local distribution. By 1926, the partnership was rolling out processed cheese in tinfoil-wrapped slabs across the country. But Walker had a separate problem. The First World War had crippled the British shipping that brought Marmite to Australian shelves. German U-boats had sunk much of the Atlantic supply. After the armistice, Marmite returned, but supply was patchy and stockists were jumpy. Walker saw a gap. In February 1923, he hired Cyril Callister. The brief was 3 sentences long. Build me an Australian Marmite. Use whatever you can find. I do not have the recipe. Cyril walked into Walker's small Spartan laboratory in Albert Park and started running experiments on spent brewers' yeast. The yeast was a waste product from Carlton and United breweries, dumped in vats behind the brewery on Bouverie Street. Kubi was happy to sell it cheap. Cyril boiled it, salted it, centrifuged out the cell debris. Vacuum concentrated the liquid, added celery and onion vegetable extracts to round out the bitterness. He worked through the southern winter into the spring of 1923. By October, he had a black, salty, glutinous paste with a smell that would later be heritage listed. Walker had the factory. Callister had the chemistry. What they were about to invent would outlive them both by a century. On the 25th of October 1923, the first jars went on sale, and nobody bought them. Chapter 3. The Naming Hat. The product on the shelf in October 1923 was not yet called Vegemite. The first jars carried a label that simply read, Pure Vegetable Extract, 2-ounce amber brown glass, no red, no yellow, no iconic packaging at all. Walker needed a name, and he needed a marketing story to hang it on. He ran a public competition with a £50 prize, equivalent to about 4,400 Australian dollars in today's money. Entries arrived by post for weeks. Walker's 7-year-old daughter, Sheila Walker, the only child he would ever have, drew the winning slip from a hat in his Albert Park office. The name on the slip was Vegemite. The official Bega Heritage record says the winning contestant was never publicly identified. But Albert Park folklore tells a different story. 2 local sisters, Hilda and Laurel Armstrong, aged 18 and 20, became known around the neighbourhood for the rest of their lives as the Vegemite Girls. Whether they actually submitted the winning entry is genuinely contested in the historical record. Some sources say yes. The company never confirmed. Treat it as folklore. The name itself is the only fact that survives the hat. The trademark was officially accepted by the Commonwealth Registrar on the 9th of November 1923, advertised in the Daily Commercial News and Shipping List on the 27th of December that year. Almost every Bois and online article still claims the trademark was registered in 1919. That is wrong. It is a copy-paste error that has propagated for decades. The correct date is November 1923. Marmite, distributed in Australia by the Sanitarium Health Food Company since 1910, dominated the yeast spread market. Sanitarium had distribution. Sanitarium had brand recognition. Sanitarium was Seventh-day Adventist and well-funded. Australians went to the corner grocer and bought the spread they recognised. They did not buy Vegemite. Some shoppers were so unimpressed they returned full jars to the retailer for a refund. Sales remained marginal through 1924, marginal through 1925, marginal through 1926. Walker advertised harder, cut the price, tried small opal glass jars with phoenix seals. Nothing. The processed cheese business was carrying the company financially, and processed cheese was getting all the marketing budget. Vegemite was a slow-bleeding loss leader. By the back end of 1927, Walker decided the problem was no longer the recipe or the price or the distribution. The problem was the name itself. Walker thought he had the spread. He didn't yet know he had the name, and in 1928 he was about to throw the name away. Marmite, Parwill. The pun was so contrived, nobody got it. Chapter 4. If Marmite, then Parwill. In 1928, Fred Walker rebranded Vegemite as Parwill. The logic, written down in his own marketing notes and quoted in Bega's Heritage Timeline, ran like this. Marmite is what Mum buys. Therefore, our spread is what Dad buys. If Marmite, then Parwill. If Marmite, then Parwill. Parwill was sold mainly in Queensland. The slogan ran in the Brisbane Courier Mail and on Queensland Railway billboards through 1928, 29, 30, 31. Sales did not improve. Most shoppers genuinely believed Parwill was a different product entirely. Some thought it was a discount knockoff. Others thought it was a brand of pet food. By 1935, Walker had folded the Parwill name and reinstated Vegemite. 7 years lost. 7 years of advertising spend incinerated. 7 years where Sanitarium ate the market. Then on the 21st of July 1935, Fred Walker died of heart disease at his home in Albert Park. He was 51 years old. His daughter Sheila, then 19, inherited what remained of his half of the business. Within months, Kraft Foods Incorporated of Chicago, Illinois, moved on the company. The 50-50 Kraft Walker Cheese Company joint venture was restructured. The American parent took the controlling majority. Fred Walker and Company Limited was absorbed into the merged entity. By 1950, the original Walker Company name was gone entirely. The trademark Vegemite was transferred to the American multinational. 82 years of foreign ownership had begun, and Australians were never told. What followed was 3 years of brilliant marketing executed by an American advertising agency. J. Walter Thompson Sidney, the local arm of the Madison Avenue Agency, opened in 1930 and immediately took the Vegemite account. They deployed 3 levers in succession. First, the coupon redemption campaign of 1935 and 36, which gave away free jars of Vegemite with every purchase of Kraft processed cheese. Second, the Limerick competition of 1937, which offered American Pontiac sedans as prizes for the best 4-line poem about Vegemite. Pontiacs in Maryborough, Pontiacs in Bendigo, Pontiacs in Cairns. The entries flooded in. And third, the medical endorsement of 1939, when the British Medical Association approved Vegemite as a vitamin B rich food. Vegemite began advertising in the British Medical Journal. Baby health columns under bylines like Sister MacDonald insisted Vegemite was essential for infant welfare. By 1942, Vegemite was in nearly every Australian pantry. The name on the jar said Vegemite. The name on the company said Kraft, Chicago, Illinois. And then Hitler invaded Poland. Chapter 5. A Rose in Every Cheek. September 1939. Australia at war. Robert Menzies on the wireless. The Department of Munitions in Melbourne already drawing up procurement schedules for the food the troops would need in the field. Vegemite was on every list. Long shelf life, effectively indefinite at room temperature, dense in B vitamins, salt stable in the tropics, light, compact, bulletproof against the kind of rain and rot that killed European preserves in 3 weeks. The department began bulk buying Vegemite by the pallet for inclusion in Australian Army field rations. By 1942, civilian supply was rationed. Kraft Walker put a per capita cap on grocer orders. The fighting forces had first call. J. Walter Thompson. Sydney wrote the wartime ad copy that ran in newspapers from Cairns to Hobart. Vegemite fights with the men up north. In all operational areas where our men and those of our allies are engaged, Vegemite is in great demand because of its value in fighting vitamin B deficiency diseases. That is why the fighting forces have first call on all Vegemite produced. And that is why Vegemite is in short supply for civilian consumption. Tobruk. El Alamein. The Owen Stanleys, Borneo. Australian gunners and infantry carrying the small black jar in their kit. The earlier slogan from 1924 had been "Put a rose in your cheeks." By 1943, the wartime ad copy had reworked it into a promise of national survival, a rose in every cheek. In 1943, the Commonwealth Government built a vegetable dehydration plant at Fisherman's Bend, on the same Port Melbourne ground that would later become the Vegemite factory. Co Rohan Leppert, City of Melbourne, said it directly in the Council Heritage hearing of 2022. In 1943, hundreds of women were recruited to work at a new vegetable dehydration factory in Port Melbourne as part of the war effort. South Melbourne, Albert Park, Port Melbourne, Middle Park. Mothers, sisters, daughters of the men who had been called up. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. And then Cyril's son, Ian Hope Callister, Cyril and Catherine's eldest, 21 years old, Royal Australian Air Force pilot, killed during a dawn fighter sortie over the Trobriand Islands, east of Papua New Guinea. The Roll of Honour circular survives at the Australian War Memorial. He never came home. 21. The man who invented the spread that fed the army watched his own son die in the Pacific, because Vegemite, however dense in B vitamins, could not stop a Japanese fighter pilot. Cyril Callister fed the army that couldn't save his son. He had his first heart attack later that same year. He kept working through the rest of the war. The Bega Heritage page records the billionth wartime jar of Vegemite was produced before VJ Day. After the surrender, civilian rationing ended and Vegemite returned to the shelves of every grocer in the country. Cyril did not get to see the jingle that made the spread immortal. On the 5th of October 1949, at his home in Kew, Melbourne, he had a second heart attack. He was dead before the ambulance reached the Royal Melbourne. He was 56 years old. His estate, valued at £45,917 for probate, went to Catherine and the surviving children. He was buried at Box Hill Cemetery on the eastern edge of Melbourne. If you visit his grave today, you will sometimes find a jar of Vegemite, emptied of its black paste and refilled with fresh flowers from someone's back garden, sitting on the headstone. A jingle was about to make the spread immortal, and the man who invented it was already dead. Chapter 6. Happy Little Vegemites, 1954. J. Walter Thompson. Sydney commissioned a young jingle writer named Alan Weeks to compose a tune for a new radio campaign. Weeks wrote 4 short lines about happy little Vegemites being bright as bright can be. Band leader Bob Gibson took the tune and arranged it as a 6/8 march, the same time signature as a parade band, the kind of pulse a 5-year-old's foot taps to without thinking. Gibson rejected the school choir J. Walter Thompson had originally booked. He brought in a professional family of singers instead. Betty Parker, the queen of Sydney commercials, imitating a child's voice. Her younger siblings Julia and Stephen Parker on harmony. Betty's daughter Linda Marcy on the closing solo. They recorded at EMI Studios Sydney in 1953, and the spot first aired on radio in 1954. The lyrics paraphrased ran like this: "We're happy little Vegemites, bright as bright can be. We all enjoy our Vegemite for breakfast, lunch and tea. Mummy says we're growing stronger every single week because we love our Vegemite. We all adore our Vegemite. It puts a rose in every cheek." In 1959, the company filmed the now iconic television ad at Pagewood Studios on the southern edge of Sydney. 8 children dancing and performing acrobatics on and around a giant fiberglass Vegemite jar. The baton twirling 7-year-old standing on top of the jar was Trish May, later Trish Kavanagh, recruited from the Helen DePaul School of Dance in Sydney. She was paid £27 for the shoot, £3 more than the other children. She has eaten Vegemite every day of her life since. The jingle entered Australian DNA. By the late 1960s, Bega's own audience research showed that more Australians could sing the Happy Little Vegemites jingle accurately from memory than could sing the national anthem. By 1976, J. Walter Thompson had refreshed the campaign with the line, "Pass the Vegemite please, Mum." By the late 1980s, the original black and white 1959 ad had been remastered and partially colourised, broadcast in heavy rotation through to 2010. In April 1984, a 115-gram jar of Vegemite became the very first product in Australia ever scanned at a supermarket checkout. The transaction was at the Woolworths store in Chullora, near Sambabal. The price was 66 cents. The jar is on permanent display at the Woolworths Sydney head office. In 1981, the Melbourne band Men at Work released the song Down Under. 4 lines into the second verse came the phrase, "He just smiled and gave me a Vegemite sandwich." The song hit number 1 on the Australian charts, then number 1 in the United Kingdom, then number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in the United States. Vegemite went global on the back of an Australian rock anthem, written about an Australian icon, sung in pubs from Detroit to Dublin. And the entire time, every cent of profit on every jar went back to a corporate parent in Chicago, Illinois. For 68 years, Australia sang to a jingle written by an American advertising agency about a product owned by an American conglomerate, and nobody noticed. Then, on the 7th of December 1988, Philip Morris bought Kraft. Vegemite belonged to a tobacco company. Chapter 7. Tobacco on Your Toast. Philip Morris. Companies, the New York tobacco conglomerate that owned Marlboro and Virginia Slims, paid $12.9 billion for Kraft Foods Incorporated. At the time, the largest non-oil acquisition in American corporate history. For the next 19 years, Vegemite's ultimate parent company was an American tobacco firm. Every Australian child eating Vegemite toast for breakfast was technically eating a Philip Morris product. Every primary school lunchbox in the country contained a small black jar of yeast paste owned by the same shareholders who owned the cigarettes that gave their grandfathers lung cancer. In 1999, the entrepreneur and patriot Dick Smith went public. Smith, founder of Dick Smith Electronics, launched a campaign against foreign ownership of Australian icons. He named Vegemite specifically. He launched his own Australian-owned alternative, Ozamite, in 2012. The Ozamite trademark fight ran in IP Australia and the federal court for years against a competing patriotic spread called Ozimite. None of it shifted Vegemite's market share. Australians kept buying the American jar. In 2007, Kraft Foods Incorporated demerged from Altria. Philip Morris's renamed holding company, Kraft became a standalone US food multinational. Then, in 2010, Kraft acquired the British confectioner Cadbury for $19.5 billion. The acquisition included Cadbury's Australian operations. On the 1st of October 2012, Kraft Foods Incorporated split itself in two. The North American grocery business spun off as Kraft Foods Group, which later merged with Heinz in 2015 to form Kraft Heinz. The remaining global snacks and grocery business was renamed Mondelez International, headquartered in Deerfield, Illinois. Vegemite, with its Australia and New Zealand operations, went to Mondelez. Inside the Mondelez portfolio, Vegemite was a non-core brand. Oreos and Cadbury and Toblerone and Milka were the global power brands. Vegemite was a regional curiosity that contributed less than half of 1% of group revenue. The career path that emerged inside Kraft ANZ became its own corporate globalist parable. George Zogby, Lebanese-Australian, ex-Fonterra dairy executive, was Kraft Foods ANZ Managing Director from 2007 to 2009. He moved to Chicago to run Kraft's US cheese and dairy business. He climbed to Kraft Heinz US Chief Operating Officer between 2015 and 2017. Then in 2020, he came home to take the CEO role at Arnott's after the American private equity giant KKR bought the biscuit maker from Campbell Soup. Australia, Chicago, Kraft Heinz, APR. The corporate globalist career arc made manifest in one executive resume, 5 flags, 3 corporate parents, 82 years of foreign ownership, and Australia did not know. Nobody. On the AFL Grand Final of 2009, Kraft did something so stupid it made every Australian wake up. Chapter 8. iSnack 2.0. In June 2009, Kraft Foods Australia launched a new product on supermarket shelves, a Vegemite cream cheese hybrid in a small white tub. The packaging said, "Name me." The label invited the public to submit a name in a national competition. 48,000 entries arrived in 3 months. 3 million tubs sold under the placeholder name. Kraft's marketing team reviewed the submissions in their North Sydney office and prepared the reveal for the biggest broadcast event on the Australian calendar. Saturday, the 26th of September, 2009. The AFL Grand Final on Channel 7. Geelong against St Kilda at the MCG. At 3/4 time, in a national television commercial, Kraft announced the chosen name, iSnack 2.0. The submission had come from Dean Robbins, a 27-year-old web developer from Sydney. His own published quote, captured by the Mumbrella Industry blog and the Harvard Business School Digital Innovation Case Study, read like this. It was all a bit tongue-in-cheek, really. The I phenomenon and Web 2.0 have been recent revolutions, and I thought the new Vegemite name could do the same. The spokesperson for Kraft was Simon Talbot, Head of Corporate Affairs, Kraft Foods, Australia and New Zealand. Talbot defended the name on radio and television through the night of the grand final and into the Sunday morning. Within 24 hours, the hashtag VegFail was the 7th trending topic on Australian Twitter. A Facebook poll set up by an enraged consumer attracted over 20,000 respondents. 97% of them hated the name. On the 30th of September 2009, 4 days after the reveal, Kraft retracted. Talbot's official statement, captured by the Illawarra Mercury and printed in every metropolitan daily the next morning, was this: "We have been overwhelmed by the passion for Vegemite and the new product. The new name has simply not resonated with Australians." A second public vote was launched. Six options. 30,357 ballots cast over the next week. On the 7th of October 2009, the winning name was announced: Vegemite Cheesy Bite. It took 36% of the vote, beating Vegemite Smooth on 23% and Vegemite on 20%. The intuitive crowd favourite, Cheesy Mite, had already been trademarked by a separate Australian baker for the Cheesy Mite scroll. Kraft could not legally use it. The remaining iSnack 2.0 jars sold on eBay as collector's items. Some are still listed today. For the first time since 1935, Australia realised the jar was American. And Australia was furious. The country had been sleepwalking through 82 years of foreign ownership. Then an American food multinational tried to rename the most patriotic spread on the continent after an Apple product launch. The cognitive dissonance broke the spell. An Australian dairy cooperative was watching from Bega, NSW. They had been waiting since 1899. Chapter 9. Bega. Bega, on the far south coast of New South Wales, 400 kilometres south of Sydney, down the Princes Highway. Dairy country since the 1850s. Green hills, black and white Friesians grazing the river flats, fog rolling off the Bega River at dawn. On the 1st of July 1899, a group of local dairy farmers met at Lagoon Street, Bega, and incorporated the Bega Cooperative Creamery Company. The first factory opened the following year. Cheese production began in 1953. For more than a century, Bega operated as a farmer-owned cooperative. Profits flowed back to the milk suppliers, not to outside shareholders. Decisions were made at annual general meetings in the Bega showgrounds. The model was almost extinct in the rest of Australian agriculture by the 1990s. Bega kept it. In 2008, the cooperative restructured into an unlisted public company. On the 19th of August 2011, Bega Cheese Limited listed on the Australian Securities Exchange. About half of the publicly traded shares remained held by the original farmer suppliers. The chairman was Barry Irvin, a third-generation Bega Valley dairy farmer who had taken the chair in 2000. The CEO was Aidan Coleman, a New Zealand-born ex-Fonterra executive who had run Bega since before the float. In August 2016, Bega's trading update to the ASX included a quiet line announcing Coleman's planned retirement. That same week, acquisition rumours began circulating in the Australian Financial Review. Mondelez was looking to divest its Australian grocery brands. Bega was the rumoured buyer. On the 18th of January 2017, United States time, the 19th of January 2017 Sydney time, the announcement came. Mondelez International would sell its Australia and New Zealand grocery business to Bega Cheese for 460 million Australian dollars. The brands included Vegemite, Zoosh salad dressings, Bonnock beef stock drink, Kraft peanut butter, Kraft processed cheese, and the Australian licence to use the Kraft trademark. Approximately 200 employees would transfer with the deal. Philadelphia cream cheese was retained by Mondelez as a global power brand. Bega's share price closed up 15.2% on the day at $5.16. Barry Irvin's statement was in the morning papers and on every breakfast radio show. Ecstatic to be bringing together two companies with an Australian heritage spanning over 200 years. Strong building blocks to enable Bega Cheese to become a great FMCG business. Dick Smith, who had spent 2 decades campaigning against the foreign ownership of Vegemite, told the Australian Associated Press the same morning, "I am delighted. We would have paid more for it because there are millions of Australians who would invest in a Vegemite company. Every mum and dad, everyone would." Paul van Herwaarden took over as Chief Executive Officer on the 1st of February 2017. He executed the integration. He moved the Vegemite line over to Bega's payroll without a shutdown. In 2019, when Kraft Heinz attempted to relaunch peanut butter in Australia using the same blue and yellow trade dress that Bega had bought, Van Heerwaarden took them to the Federal Court of Australia and won. The High Court denied Kraft Heinz special leave to appeal in 2020. In 2020, Bega completed a $534 million acquisition of Lion Dairy and Drinks. Pura Milk, Big M Dairy Farmers, Farmers Union. All of them came home through the same Nieuwsouwbouw's Dairy Cooperative. Nieuwsouwbouw Labour closed Everleek in 1988. Nieuwsouwbouw's dairy farmers brought Vegemite home in 2017. The market did not decide. The cooperative did. The factory at Port Melbourne is still there. So is the smell. And the smell is now legally protected. Chapter 10. The Smell of Vegemite. One Vegemite Way, Port Melbourne. 6.34 hectares of factory floor and Alamein building, bound by Douglas Street, Salmon Street, Turner Street, and the Cook Street on-ramp of the West Gate Freeway. The address was renamed at a ceremonial breakfast on the 4th of April 2016 by the then Lord Mayor of Melbourne, Robert Doyle. Doyle introduced himself at the lectern with one line: "I'm a Vegemite boy since 1955. The site sits inside Fisherman's Bend, the 480 hectares urban renewal precinct on the southern bank of the Yarra. It is the largest urban renewal project ever undertaken in Australia. By the early 2030s, most of Fisherman's Bend will be apartment towers and university campuses. The Vegemite factory is the one industrial site that will not be demolished. Production at Port Melbourne runs at approximately 22,235 gram jars a year. Roughly 80% of Australian households have a jar in the pantry. The original yeast factory on the site was built in 1945 and demolished in 2006, which is why the surviving heritage protection is local rather than state. The 1956 administration building, designed by the Melbourne firm Oakley and Parkes, still anchors the corner of Salmon and Turner. It was painted black and grey under Mondelez ownership. The colours are now part of the heritage protection. In May 2022, the City of Melbourne Council voted to add the former Kraft Vegemite factory site to the local heritage overlay as Heritage Overlay, number 1381. The hearing also added the Salmon Street electricity substation and Shed 21 at Docklands. But the most extraordinary part of the Council's vote was the decision to formally recognise the distinctive smell of Vegemite manufacturing as intangible cultural heritage. It is believed to be the first time in Australia that an industrial smell has been heritage listed. Deputy Lord Mayor Nicholas Rees, in his statement to the Chamber, said this: "This amendment ensures that no matter who owns this site, the intangible heritage of the site, the Vegemite smell, is acknowledged and preserved into the future." On the 27th of June 2023, Bega sold the Port Melbourne factory site to the listed property group Charter Hall for $114.6 million. The transaction was a sale and leaseback. Bega took a 15-year lease with 2 5-year options, potentially extending the production tenure to 2048. Production did not pause for a single shift. The bricks changed hands. The recipe did not. Rob Carman has worked on the Vegemite line at Port Melbourne for over 51 years. He started as a teenager in the 1970s. He was on the floor when Philip Morris bought Kraft. On the floor when iSnack 2.0 was launched. On the floor when Bega took ownership in 2017. On the floor when Charter Hall took the deed in 2023. Bega's centenary marketing in 2023 featured him by name in the PKN Packaging News profile of the factory. He is the longest-serving Vegemite worker on record. The brewer's yeast still flows from the Carlton and United Breweries plant at Abbotsford, 3 kilometres east of the city centre, CUB has supplied Vegemite's yeast since 1923. It is the same brewery, the same Bouverie Street loading dock, the same 18 tonnes of yeast extract a day flowing through the same pipework that fed Cyril Callister's first experimental batch in February of that year. But CUB is no longer Australian. On the 1st of June 2020, after 15 months of regulatory review, Asahi Group Holdings of Tokyo completed its $16 billion acquisition of Carlton and United Breweries from AB InBev. The Japanese brewer divested Stella Artois and a handful of cider brands as a competition remedy and kept the rest. QB's head brewer at Abbotsford today is Sarah Lang. In a 2024 statement on the Bega Food Bank donation program, she said this: "Our Abbotsford brewery has provided the yeast in Vegemite since it was first sold back in 1923. It's a privilege to be able to leverage this long-standing relationship between two iconic Melbourne sites. The bricks are owned by a Sydney property fund. The yeast is owned by a Japanese brewery. The smell belongs to Melbourne. 3 lessons, and then we go back to Box Hill." Chapter 11. Box Hill. Stand at the gates of Box Hill Cemetery in late 2026. It is a 40-minute drive east of central Melbourne, on Whitehorse Road, opposite the old TAFE. The cemetery is large and quiet, and the magpies are loud in the river-red gums. Cyril Percy Callister's grave is in the Methodist section. The headstone reads simply, Cyril Percy Callister, 16th February 1893 to 5th of October 1949. Sometimes there is nothing on the stone. Sometimes there is a small jar of Vegemite emptied of paste, refilled with white roses or yellow daisies from someone's back garden, sitting where you would normally place a vase. Nobody knows who leaves them. They are left by visitors who came specifically to find this grave. 14 kilometres west of where you are standing, the factory at One Vegemite Way is making 60,000 jars today. Same brewer's yeast supplier since 1923. Same Bouverie Street pipework. Same heritage-listed smell drifting south across the Yarra into the suburbs. Lesson 1. Foreign ownership is theft by patience. Kraft bought Walker's company in 1935 for a fraction of what the brand would later be worth. Philip Morris bought Kraft in 1988 for $12.9 billion United States dollars. Mondelez inherited Vegemite in 2012 as a non-core asset in a snacks and confectionery split. Bega bought it back in 2017 for 460 million Australian dollars. For 82 years, Australia paid premium prices for a foreign-owned spread it thought was its own. The Yorkshire boy from Shute, who invented the recipe, died believing the company was still half Australian. He was wrong by 14 years. By 1950, the Walker name was gone entirely from the corporate registry. The brand was wholly American. Foreign ownership is not invasion. It is theft you forget about. Lesson 2. The cooperative outlasts the corporation. Bega was founded as a dairy cooperative in 1899, owned by farmers, accountable to a community. It outlasted Walker, Kraft, Philip Morris and Mondelez. Every multinational that bought Vegemite eventually decided it was a non-core asset and sold it. Bega did not. Bega bought because the brand mattered to the country its shareholders milked cows in. Compare the rail story we have told before on this channel. Nisausfals chose to close Everleak in 1988. Queensland Labor governments chose to keep Maryborough open across 35 years. The market did not decide between them. Premiers did. Nisausfals dairy farmers, organised as a cooperative, did the same thing for Vegemite that Queensland Labor did for Maryborough. The corporation answers to shareholders. The cooperative answers to the dairy farmers. Vegemite came home through the dairy farmers. Lesson 3. Heritage is what survives the sale. The factory bricks are owned by Charter Hall now. The brewer's yeast comes from a Japanese-owned brewery. the trademark Vegemite, is back in Australian hands. What is Australian about an Australian icon when the bricks, the yeast, the supply chain and the workforce are all part of a global system? In 2022, the City of Melbourne and Bega answered the question together. The smell. The heritage is not the bricks or the yeast or even the recipe. The heritage is the smell of Vegemite manufacturing drifting south from Salmon Street on a hot February afternoon. That smell is heritage listed forever. It is the only part of the operation that cannot be sold to anyone, back at Box Hill. Cemetery, the magpies are still loud. Somebody has left a fresh jar on Cyril's headstone. White daisies pushed in among the dried sprigs of last week's rosemary. A child, eating Vegemite toast in Erskyneville this morning, cannot trace the supply chain backward through her toast to the Port Melbourne line, to the Charter Hall title deed, to the Asahi truck delivering yeast from Abbotsford to a Japanese boardroom in Tokyo. She does not need to. The smell is the same as it was the year Cyril Callister walked into Walker's Albert Park laboratory and asked how much brewer's yeast the brewery could spare. The jar is the same. The country isn't. The yeast comes from Tokyo. The flowers come from Box Hill. Vegemite cheated death. Australia didn't.